and good afternoon to all of those that are joining both in person and virtually. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion at the Global Decarbonization Accelerator Pavilion. Thank you to the COP28 Energy Transition Team and the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center for having us here at GDA Connect to engage in these valuable discussions. These panel discussions are being live streamed and will be published on the Atlantic Council webpage. Please visit the webpage for more details about the GDA Connect agenda and to view the recordings of the sessions. So without further ado, let me start the session. My name is Philip Cornell. I'm the Global Practice Lead for Energy and Sustainability at Economist Impact, which many of you might know by its former name, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I'm also a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to have a chance to welcome such an esteemed panel for this topic. Climate security refers to the impacts of the climate crisis on peace and security. Climate change can trigger competition for resources, insecure livelihoods, and mass displacement, increasing the risk of social tensions and instability. That necessarily has an impact on the strategic challenges facing security planners and military forces, as well as the operational environment in which they act. This panel is titled From Risk to Resilience. And indeed, the increasing the resilience of civilian human systems to climate change, from food and water to energy and to health, are important so that external climate stressors don't cause instability and violence, and ultimately demand a military response or disaster management. So that's one part. Another part is the resilience of military forces themselves. How can they improve to operate in climate-affected situations, from extreme temperatures to wetter and flood-prone environments? In many cases, resilient operational technologies might also be low carbon, like renewable energy platforms at forward operating bases to reduce fuel supply risk, or mini-grids at installations which insulate them from disruptions to the civilian grid. And yet another part is mitigating climate change itself, because we recognize it's a strategic concern and a force multiplier. So while climate runs through all of these are distinct challenges. So where do they overlap? Military forces are major emitters, but readiness and capability can't be allowed to suffer in the name of emissions reduction. At the same time, governments still have huge scope to reduce their own emissions, both through policy to advance net zero goals. In a broad sense, this is obviously affecting resilience as well. So how do we disentangle these challenges while also recognizing the common climate factor? To address these, I'm really excited to welcome the panel we have in store for that. The Honorable Meredith Berger, to my left, is Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, and Chief Sustainability Officer for the Department of the Navy. Sherry Goodman is Co-Chair of the Commission on Nuclear Energy and Climate Security and a Board Director of the Atlantic Council. And Kareem Amin is member of the Executive Board of Siemens Energy. So thank you all for joining me today. Let me start with a basic question for all of you. I mentioned these distinct nature of these issues. So how do you consider the major challenges of climate security, and what's resilience in that context? And maybe Meredith, I could start with you.
Sure, thank you. So all of the things that you described are what is rolling up to the considerations for how the Department of the Navy and how the military as a whole is thinking about this challenge. We often talk about the conflict continuum. We also have the climate continuum. And so when we talk about security, from that first instance of any sort of disruption, so resources that breed conflict, we are there at the front end trying to practice that diplomacy, partnership, to be able to make sure that any community that we are present and a part of are getting the benefit of those resilient beginnings. But if we get to the other end, it is also pulling on our mission set. We are the first responders. When the world calls, your Department of the Navy, United States Navy, and Marine Corps respond, and we take that seriously, but it is an enhanced mission set. It is asking us to do more and also restricting our ability to make those quick and timely and holistic responses. And so from the very beginning of where there is that impact that creates conflict to when we see it full-fledged, whether it is a humanitarian assistance situation or otherwise, that is our continuum that we are operating on, and so we are looking at how to be resilient in every step of the way, but we do think that combat effective is climate effective, and that's the mindset that we are approaching everything.
Great. So being both prepared to address the challenges and working with other stakeholders to look at this. Maybe Sherry, maybe I could go to you next. Similarly, so what are the major challenges, and what is resilience? Is it about achieving net zero, improving resilience, or is it both?
Well, thank you very much, Phil, and thanks to the Atlantic Council, and it's a pleasure to be here with the COP28 organizers as well. So I think about climate security, we characterize it as a threat multiplier for instability. In many parts of the world today, we see that it increases the likelihood of tension as it adds to existing threats, and we face many around the world today. At the same time, and it's very exciting to be here at COP and see all the enthusiasm and the ambition, the action towards really fomenting climate resilience and the green energy transition. We see those opportunities to build resilience across fragile regions of the world by, as Meredith said, getting ahead of the problem and kind of working with communities across development, diplomacy, and defense as supporting our security partners and our actors, and also leading by example in this sector, in the end. And that means decarbonizing across defense by looking at how we move towards net zero through a variety of means, whether it's nuclear, electrification, our supply chains. We can get into the details, but there are many opportunities here to accelerate through the energy transition in ways that also serve as a force multiplier for our combat systems.
Thanks so much, Sherry, and I hope that we can get into that, like what that actually means, decarbonization, whether it's on the civilian side or among the forces. Kareem, maybe over to you. Siemens technologies are really helping both to decarbonize the energy system and to improve resilience. So what are these climate security challenges? What do they look like from your side?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Thank you so much for the invitation and being here. I think really I want to add to where the fellow panelists brought their points. And when we look at the topic of resilience, security, and I would even add affordability, these are the three things we normally look at. And I think if you look at the war from Russia towards Ukraine, it brought really things right into front stage. Right? So we started to see clearly that energy is being used as a weapon. We started to see that the idea of pipeline gas is prioritized because it's cheap, and then you have a huge interdependency on one country, made I think Europe and the world pay dearly. And then of course you look as well as the current push towards the transition and decarbonization through renewable energy. It also brings certain issues and certain problems that created in certain parts of the world. You look at Texas, for example, we had the snowstorm and there was like 10 days or more complete shutdown, right? So what we try to do is try to educate ourselves, but also open up to the wider stakeholder to really understand the complexity of the problem, because it's not just one dimension. You really need to look at, yes, as fast as possible, get out of fossil, but renewable is not for free. There is a cost for that, and society needs to be prepared to pay for it. It's not just the problem of the government. It's not just the problem of technology. So how do you wrap this up? And then, in the end of the day, it's also a matter of affordability, right? So it's economic development, factor cost, and so on. So put the three things together, and then in the end you need to come up with the best solution that I would say would vary from one region to the other and from one country to the other.
Yeah. I mean, affordability is a key part of this question because in many parts it can be really the difference between energy provision and energy deprivation, talking about triggers of stability. Maybe Sherry, I could go back to you. Kareem was talking a little bit about the need to sort of decarbonize broadly in the intersection with resilience. So, what are some key levers to move forward with net zero commitments, and how do sustainability considerations sort of factor into that?
Well, one great example is we need to reduce supply chain risks across our energy sector. And one of the ways we can do that is by not having to transport as much liquid fuel. Our military learned the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan that we were putting a lot of soldiers and Marines at risk transporting fuel and water to the front. So now there's been a decade of innovation in how to power our forces for remote missions that allows for more renewable on-site and storage, and also decarbonizing supply chains where available. Everything from hydrogen to looking at using small modular reactors. And so there are a lot of opportunities out there that will help us move towards a goal. And I'd say, militaries are setting themselves some very ambitious goals today of having net zero, particularly at military bases. We already have some in the United States, and I'm sure we're not alone in looking at a combination of microgrids with renewables and other sources to enable us to move to that. And that also provides energy security in the local community. And that's what's important, because as we move towards net zero, we also want to have energy security. In other words, you want to have your power, whatever source it is, when you need it. And so distributed energy resources become very important.
Great, and I'd love to tease this out a little bit. Maybe, Meredith, I can go to you. So Sherry is talking, pretty specifically about military energy management and operational energy management and security. I think we like to think of measures to improve resilience, either in civilian or in military sense, as also being lower carbon. But is that really the case? And why should they necessarily be linked in the first place?
Sure, and I just want to pick up on one of Sherry's points to really drive home how critically important this is. Sherry, you mentioned the Iraq and Afghanistan years. It was for every 50 convoys of fuel, we had a Marine that was lost or wounded. That is very consequential. So when we talk about energy, whether it is operational or our installation and shore energy, I like to think of it as mission assurance per megawatt hour, because it is very much tied to how effective we can be, and it's the same on our operational energy side as well. And so this is very, very tied to the way that we're operating. We are cognizant that we are one of the greatest contributors to what we see in terms of fuel consumption and emissions and all of these other components that go into it. And so we are very committed to making sure that we are building up our resilience through a variety of ways. It is shrinking that logistics tail. It is making sure that there is a surefire tie to the way that we are able to achieve these objectives of the mission sets that we have, which are diverse and have high requirements, but also that we are reducing those emissions. And so this is looking at components like hydrogen and incorporating that into a way that we are operating as much more efficient. We are looking at how we can incorporate a diversity of reliable, redundant, renewable energy sources. Storage is a big component of that. And then it is how we build, how we are using water as a resource as well, and how that all comes together to make up our portfolio as a whole. And so there are a variety of directives that we've gotten from the president on down that ensure that we have that guidance, that direction. And as the chief sustainability officer for the department, I have put that into our requirements as well, so that it is actually how we're doing business in the Department of the Navy.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And maybe I'll just go back to Sherry just to wrap up this discussion. So, again, what Meredith is talking about are things that are obviously increasing operational flexibility. Those things like, improving efficiency that can also make operations more secure. That can be also in materials in aircraft, as well as what's going on, for example, to reduce fuel supply chains. But it seems like there would be major pushback, it has been, from militaries, where it seems to be that low carbon or sustainability or emissions reductions might hinder or be at the sacrifice of operational readiness. So how do we ensure that our strive to reduce the emissions in military operations and military systems don't affect military readiness, perhaps in the negative sense?
Well, we always have to consider military effectiveness, and that's vitally important. And when Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, spoke yesterday, he talked about decarbonizing defense while ensuring continued military effectiveness. So that, of course, is paramount. So that's why the way we transition also is important. But as Meredith and I just noted, long liquid fuel supply chains have put our forces at risk. So as we move to find alternative ways to power the force, that actually improves military effectiveness. And as we think about the kinds of ways in which our forces can be deployed in the future, whether it's for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, for which there's an increasing what we call demand signal because of climate risks mounting around the world with extreme weather events, or whether it's in the higher end, more higher end threat environment, a peer competition. We think about having to deploy forces to remote regions and at great distances. And there, when you're in this what's called a contested logistics environment, the more you can be efficient and secure in your energy systems as you deploy, and not depend on long supply chains. We say the logistics can, wag the tail, drag down the fighting tooth of the military force. So we want that not to happen. And the analogy in our civilian life, we all experience it because we all live through more extreme weather events now, whether it's the Texas freeze or a flood or increased extreme weather events, and then we want to continue to power. We often lose power, for example, in our own homes. So what do people do today? Then they go out and get their own generator. Well, how are most generators, fueled today? With diesel. So, we need to be thinking about what are the alternatives so that we can each have more reliable, secure, but net zero power.
Meredith, want to follow?
And I just wanted to jump in quickly because we actually have the first net zero energy base in the Department of Defense, which is at Albany, Georgia, and they are actually producing more energy than they require, and they're able to provide energy to the community as well. And so there is a very close link to where we are and how we work as a community when it comes to energy as well. But all of the things that you were asking about and everything that Sherry was highlighting, I didn't want to miss sharing that point, but it is highly dependent on technology and being able to do that effectively and put together a suite of solutions that's able to build that out. And so it is companies like Siemens that are able to provide that support both to community and to military.
Yeah, fabulous. Kareem, this is a great place to step in. Siemens obviously provides a lot of the technologies that are both improving resilience in places like on the grid and low carbon, both in military and in non-military applications. Could you tell us a little bit specifically about those technologies? And
yeah, sure. Actually, there is a very strong connection also between developing technology and military, because a lot of these I would say, forward-looking technology has been developed in the beginning and funded and used by the military, and then it gets commercialized and scaled up. Look at the SMRs that Sherry talked about, the small modular reactors. This came from military applications in submarines, and then it was, I think the US was the forefront runner for that, and then you take it now and you look at scaling it up for a 300 megawatt or 70 megawatt kind of applications, and then it goes and gets implemented in different parts of the world. Very, I would say, cost effective compared to conventional nuclear. can be deployed in much shorter time frames. CapEx is cheaper. So I think it's one of the technologies that is very promising for a net zero or let's say cleaner energy in the future. Also, in military, you really need, resources are scarce, and you really need to be very careful of what you use and so on. And I think this is also one topic we, as in our civilian life, need to understand that it's also a topic of demand management, right? So it is not in abundance anymore. We need to be very careful in how we use the resources. And we in Siemens are also looking at how do we provide technologies through AI, digitalization, etc., to manage the grids, understand how the grids are going to work, and based on this, look at how our energy producing assets can optimally be utilized, and then how do you complement this with storage? When do you store electricity? When do you turn electricity into hydrogen? When do you use hydrogen for power generation applications, or for transportation applications, or for industry applications? So there's a huge, I would say, overlay with AI, with digitalization that comes on top to enable energy systems to be used in a much more efficient way and a more environmental friendly way. Hydrogen, I think you mentioned the use of hydrogen. Hydrogen, whether it's used in combustion or it's used in fuel cells and so on, also the foundation of it is military applications. So I think we are working on all these aspects, and I think, as I said earlier, on one hand side we have imminent need right now for energy security. And if you look at the LNG capacity, it has increased by 16% since the Russian war. So we were very good in really responding to short-term risk. That's not exactly the case when you look at longer-term risk with climate change, and that's, I think, where the focus needs to be, and the scalability of technology is needed.
Fabulous, thanks. And maybe I want to stick on that a little bit. I mean, I was sort of trying to draw out where there's potential trade-offs on the operational side, but also on the wider civilian systemic side. It seems like, as we have greater penetration, for example, of variable renewable energy, that can bring sort of resilience risks on its own. So requiring more resilience on the grid, flexibility on the grid. How do we manage some of those concerns, and are there sort of resilience concerns in a low carbon economy that we should be considering?
Briefly, not to take all the time, but you really touched the point 100%. And this is where I have my own dilemma as someone very much into this industry, but also as say, in my private life. I think there is the awareness or the conviction that renewable is for free. In reality, yes, of course, the sun and the wind we don't pay for it, but you really need to pay for the grid, big time, right? And I think also the rules of the past does not necessarily work for the future. If you look at advanced societies, take Europe, most of the subsidies for rooftop solar panels, for putting a battery into your basement and so on, is really, can be accessed by above median household income. Now, these are the people who could buy a solar panel on top of the roof or put a battery in their basement, right? But with all the renewables being put offshore and all the investments you need to put on the grid to get the offshore wind to the shore, the society needs to pay for that, and this is most probably the people who cannot afford the battery and cannot afford the rooftop. So I think the economic equation needs to be adapted, and it's not, right? So there is resilience for sure, because you use all the resources that you have, but I think we still have a lot of work to do on the regulation, but also on the updating this infrastructure.
Great. Sherry, maybe we can talk a little bit about that work. So Karim mentioned also at the beginning the importance of the military as a space for demonstration and deployment, for example. And obviously there's a lot of room for things like green public procurement that the military can really do. So how should governments be thinking differently about doing business differently to achieve net zero goals?
Well, I think governments have a role to play in providing sort of in providing both the investment, the opportunity, the creating the whole landscape that enables us to make that energy transition. So we see the investment across many societies. We see trying to address both the imbalance in subsidies and taxes. We see the spurring of innovation through a variety of incentives. And then I think in certain sectors, technology and innovation, of course, has always been very important in the defense sector. So let me just use nuclear as an example now. Of course, nuclear has powered our submarines and our aircraft carriers for a long time. We've had large baseload nuclear power, civilian power around the world. But now we're moving into next generation advanced nuclear with small modular reactors and microreactors. And let's say this is not your grandmother's nuclear reactor. And that's what we have to get beyond, because we're in a new era of technology where we can address the issues of safety, security, and non-proliferation. And those are all vitally important. They have to be addressed. Part of the work that I've been doing with the Commission on Nuclear Energy and Climate Security is to examine how we need to have more sources like nuclear, of baseload of nuclear power in a net-free world, and how we can advance this critically important area of technology that we can use both to power military applications, and we have some military bases in the U.S. that are going to be demonstration sites. So demonstrating and pilot projects can sort of show how the technology can be used, can give companies like Siemens and others the opportunity to show their first mover opportunity that then leads to additional commercial options.
Great. Meredith, let's stick to this. You talked a little bit at the beginning about partnerships with local communities. And Sherry and Kareem have just talked about how the government and the military can be a conduit for improving technologies in those areas. So how can we do business differently with local communities and utilities? And how can the public sector improve the mix of solutions that are executed in partnership with installations, with local communities, and with commercial energy?
And both of my panelists made great points. You have my mind turning on a few different things. But most importantly, we need a diversified grid as a society, as a country for the United States. Globally, it's an important consideration. And it is what we need as a military, because you said you 100% agree. We 90% rely on the commercial grid. And so there is a big dependency there in terms of making sure that when we need to be on, that the lights are on. For us, that is mission assurance. For a community, it is health, safety, welfare, and the interdependency there is critically important. And so as we think about how to work together and how to do business, we have a variety of opportunities, and I'll start with what we have legally in the country. And the United States has leaned forward in terms of legislation. We have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. It offers tremendous value and intention in the way that money is budgeted. As you talked about prioritization, it is always easy to find where values are when you look at somebody's budget. And our Congress has signaled that innovation, resilience, and energy are important. And so the community grants that are in there that can be combined and drive forward so that we do have that diversity and that availability of a variety of options when it comes not only to energy but to water, and also the way that we are looking at the infrastructure in support of both and the infrastructure that we build going forward are all tremendous ways to be able to partner from a military perspective, from the Department of the Navy. When we are in a community, we very much value being a part of that community. We recognize the interdependence, and that is where we find our partnerships. And so that is one place that there is value. our first net zero base that is in the whole Department of Defense is because of partnerships with industry, with local educators, with everybody who made the ecosystem available to ensure the success of that holistic approach, not only for the military installation, but also for the community that surrounds, supports, and actually makes it home. This is true on a global scale. No matter where the Navy and Marine Corps are, all of those interdependencies, those community priorities, and those opportunities for partnership present in different ways too, because we are all facing the same existential drive here in terms of ensuring that we have what we need to do when we need to do it. That's readiness. That's the readiness that we've been talking about, whether it is military readiness, whether it is community readiness. It is ensuring tools, training, resources, and ability to be able to survive at the task at hand. And so when I talk about this, at the end of the day, I say climate readiness is mission readiness. And that is the same for community readiness too. And so as we think about these partnerships, it is in funding, it is in finance, to the point that both of my co-panelists made, because we need to make sure that the finance funding is in support of the values that we have clearly stated, and I think we are set up to do that. It is a matter of taking the action and rewarding the innovation that allows us to drive towards that. And we are an eager, willing, and thoughtful partner in all of this as well, so through third-party finance and being able to partner and finding Pathfinder projects, whether it is within the United States or around the world. The global footprint and the global responsibility is one that the United States military takes seriously, and one that we recognize we have an opportunity to contribute on as we look towards a resilient energy future.
Amazing. Thanks. Great points. And we're coming up at time, so I'd like to just round out the discussion by finishing this question of partnerships to Sherry and also to Kareem. So Sherry, you've thought a lot about those partnerships also within the federal government as well as between civil and military. What are the most important, let's say, stakeholders that you need to develop relations with, for example, within the federal government? And how do we use them to address some of these financing concerns as well that Meredith was talking about?
Okay, well, that's a great point. We need to be able to think creatively in the U.S. interagency process, both about how we work in a 3D or almost 4D realm now, diplomacy, development, defense, and disaster. Clearly, disaster risk reduction is the goal, but increasingly we're responding to disaster, so a 4D approach is important. We need to marshal all the resources to come together increasingly from our finance, whether it's the USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, or the Treasury Department, or other forms of financing to address these challenges. And then, we need to look at this. It's well beyond the U.S. We need to use our allies and partners, whether it's just within NATO, within the EU, within the broader set of across the Pacific, or here in this region. I'm looking up here at this net zero nuclear outside our room with the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, which the U.S. and other companies have been working very closely with, which is important because as we move into a new era, for example, in nuclear, we have to have those partnerships that it's going to ensure the safety and security and the non-proliferation of that future nuclear supply. And that is, as more countries look to the nuclear solution, we need to ensure that by those secure partnerships through countries who have joined the NPT and are part of it.
Great, thanks. And Kareem, let me just finish it off with you. I mean, obviously Siemens is working globally.
Yeah.
Partnerships are both technological, civilian, and with government. How do you consider the most important partnerships and stakeholders?
Yeah, I think it's the understanding and the awareness of different stakeholders that it takes a little bit of courage and time to try new things, and sometimes they work from the first trial, sometimes they don't. But I mean, I could go into a lot of examples, but let me very quickly pick on the US. Take the hydrogen, for example. In US, we've seen a lot of encouragement to start co-firing of hydrogen into gas turbines. We did this, one of the largest utilities in the US, Constellation, where we put around 40% of hydrogen into a gas turbine. They didn't know that it will work. They spent also time and effort, took a risk, and it worked. We tried with some of the other utilities completely new solutions with regards to electrolyzers that creates hydrogen from water and electricity. They also didn't know it would work or not. It took some time, but it did. So I think it's really the tolerance, right? That technologies need somebody beside companies. Because you need to test it in a site, you need to test it in real life conditions. So there comes regulations, there comes partners in the industry, there comes also the finance community, and that's my last statement, because I don't mean it in any negative way. We also get a lot of support there, but it cannot only be funding from governments, right? There needs to be a complete system. This short-term view of you're good as your last quarter doesn't really work with the long cycle of innovation. So there also needs to be some work to be done. I would say the climate change risk is not going to fail on the technology. Technology is maybe not 100% ready, but it's there. It's really the regulation around it and how fast we can deploy it.
Great.
Yeah.
And what a great place to wrap this up. I mean, what I take away from this is really those three challenges of civilian energy resilience, military energy resilience, and achieving climate mitigation and low carbon are intricately linked, even if they are distinct challenges. And obviously, the partnerships between the civilian, the public sector, private sector, and finance are what we need to move this forward. So I want to close by thanking all my panelists, Meredith Berger, Sherry Goodman, and Kareem Amin. Thanks so much for joining me today. And I'd like to also close out this panel. Thank you, everyone who's listening in and streaming, for joining us today. Please join us for the next session, and we look forward to seeing you at the Energy Transition Hub. Thank you very much.